Hey there! Thanks for listening to the INFEMIT podcast, where we want to challenge the people of God to see the realities of their context and reflect on and reformulate concepts such as mission, missionary, mission field, holistic mission, and more.
Hi everyone, I'm Tori Greaves, INFEMIT's Director of Operations, calling from Southern California today. Welcome back to our conversation on Untangling the Narrative, in which we are examining colonial theologies that developed in particular contexts, as well as local forms of hope and resistance that emerged in the face of those challenges. So today is the second part of our conversation with Thandi Gamedze and Craig Stewart as we untangle the narrative of colonial and apartheid theologies in South Africa. This time we want to explore those areas of resistance and the ways in which people are faithfully witnessing in face of ongoing oppression, inequality, and injustice in South Africa. For those of you who weren't able to join our conversation last month, here's a quick recap. Thandi and Craig helped us understand a bit about how these colonial theologies emerged. A couple key concepts came up. State theology from the Kairos document refers to the theologies that upheld apartheid and the status quo by implying that Christians must support the law and government. What is called church theology was supposedly against apartheid, but because it ignored and tried to get people to move past the underlying justice issues, it also upheld the apartheid system. We identified how, even now, 30 plus years after the apartheid system fell, these issues continue to manifest today. South Africa is still consistently divided along racial lines, and churches often fail at becoming more diverse because people get uncomfortable when asked to address underlying issues. We even traced how these theologies are being replicated in other contexts as people use the belief of their own chosenness to explain their privilege and ignore the systemic injustices faced by others. If you are interested in going back and listening to that conversation, we'd love to share it with you. It is on INFEMIT's Spotify podcast. But we will just go ahead and jump in with our conversation today. Thandi and Craig, I'd love for you to just quickly introduce yourselves, especially to those who weren't able to be with us last time.
Thanks so much, Tori, and thank you for having us today. It's really a privilege to be part of this conversation. My name is Thandi Gamedze. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. I work at the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape, and I'll stop there for now.
Hi everyone, Craig Stewart. I'm also from Cape Town, South Africa. I live here with my family, with Liesel and Zach and Eliza and Vivian, and have been in the city for over 30 years. And in different ways have spent a lot of that time working within the realm of churches and particularly local congregations and how we live out God's peace and justice in the world. And I work locally in South Africa and now support some work globally. So that's my sort of life and passion, and it's lovely to be with you all.
Thank you both. Thank you for being willing to open this conversation, set the table for us. To start us off, we have been talking about narratives that justify conquest, and now we'd like to hear about narratives that emerged as a form of resistance. Particularly, are there any theologies that have been helpful in reshaping the way people think about this topic? Thandi, Craig, who'd like to begin?
I can jump in. Yeah, so definitely, I think this is one of my favorite topics, and I think it's particularly important in this time as we can see in front of our eyes theologies being used to uphold very harmful forms and systems of injustice. And I think remembering these stories of resistance is really key, because we have so much to draw from as Jesus followers in these times. We're not starting from the beginning, but we walk in the footsteps of these ancestors who have done this incredible, deep, and faithful work. So maybe to connect this conversation to the previous conversation. So Tori laid out the concepts of state and church theology, which were part of the South Africa Kairos document. But then the document also talked about prophetic theology, and this was what it called the church of the time too. And really, prophetic theology was very rooted in the present moment, in the context, and so it was very committed to a deep social analysis to recognize the injustices of the time and the roots of those injustices, to see what was actually causing this, and then to read the Bible within that context and with lenses of that context, to see what the Bible had to say about the context and the injustice of the time. And then to paint a picture of a different kind of world that the people wanted to see and wanted to create. So like the prophets of the Bible, what is this vision, this different kind of vision that we want to see, and then calling the church to act towards that vision. So I think that kind of sets the scene of I think the substance of many of these theologies of resistance. And I wanted to read a quote by someone called Takatso Mofokeng, who's an amazing Black theologian that was doing a lot of really important work in South Africa under apartheid. He edited a journal called the Journal of Black Theology in South Africa and was just a really important voice, often forgotten about, I think. But this quote that he wrote in 1987, in very heightened repression in South Africa, I think gives me a lot of hope when I think about our contemporary realities and the church today. So I wanted to read it as part of this. So he said, "It is at times like these, when political pillars are being shaken by the burning anger of oppressed Black people who have had enough of oppression, that new theological questions arise. It is at times like these, when the once large economic rivers are visibly drying, when the ideological cement that is pumped into the ears of people through the media loses its power to hold the structure of apartheid together, that the Black Christians have to think anew and redirect their faith. It is when the hitherto unshakable firm theological foundations are clearly unable to support the once mighty white ecclesial empire that Black Christians are freed to search scriptures anew for a message of support." And then he goes on to say, "Paradoxically, it is at times like these, when Black life hangs very precariously on the precipice, that a liberative theology is a real possibility. Such times of deep cleavages in life and faith are paradoxically times of great theological possibilities." So I think this really kind of sets the scene for how these theologies of resistance emerged. These times were deep crises of life and faith, where Black Christians were figuring out what to do with this faith that was theirs, but at the very same time it was being used to oppress them. And so I think this kind of formed the questions that people were asking at the time that birthed these theologies of resistance. So I'm very appreciative of Black theology, and I think it's in line with many of the traditions of liberation theology, but it was really asking the questions of what does God have to say to us in our particular context today. And I think part of it, like prophetic theology, was really a faithful reading of the signs of the times, and this commitment to read seriously the bodies of the oppressed as sacred texts in and of themselves. And so this recognition of oppressed people as sacred texts, and then these sacred texts get read in tandem with the biblical text, and from there the Bible is read towards liberation for all people. And I think, yeah, there's much more that could be said about that. So maybe I'll leave it there for now as a little taster, and hand over to Craig, and maybe we can pick up some of that conversation in the questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks, Tori and Thandi. I also pulling back into last time. So I grew up in as a white kid in apartheid South Africa in the midst of a Baptist church down the road from me, and so was very much immersed in the and I'll use this term deliberately, the idolatry of a theology that chose to maintain the status quo. Very much, if you wish, the church and to some extent the state theology of the Kairos document. So I grew up in this environment where the Christ and Jesus and the good news had very little to do with anything other than people being converted, not even discipled. And at those times, any suggestion that the gospel would upturn the status quo or question the status quo was dismissed as political, dismissed as not essential to the gospel, dismissed as communist. So it was scapegoated. And so I found myself wanting to talk about the sort of glimpses of imaginative light that broke into that story and started crowding the ground, where now I can be, as an older person, sort of engaged with and thinking about things and not threatened by something like black theology. But if you take me back 40 years, like those ideas felt quite threatening. And it's the work of Integral Mission or Missio Integral that kind of created the spaces to imagine something else, became theologies of hope. And so as a 20-year-old bumping into the notion of integral mission, that specifically through folks like René Padilla and others named this reality that if the gospel didn't call us to follow her Jesus who was liberatory, then the gospel wasn't the gospel. Opened the possibility that a faithful witnessing to Jesus brought us into the Jesus who proclaimed that he had been anointed to speak good news to the poor and proclaim the year of the Lord's Jubilee, and even spends a little bit of time unpacking that this relationship with Jubilee and land and oppression. And so that in that, for me, the sort of idea of Missio Integral and integral mission became a theology of hope as a young person, and has often been one that has pulled me forward. And I think part of our work in these days is continuing to ask, well, what does it mean today, and what are the questions that have been answered by society today, and how does that understanding of the good news of Jesus bear witness today in the face of what's climate change and all that's happening there, and what it means to the South Pacific residents and our siblings in Christ there, for example. But it provided that opportunity and those questions. And so I think I am of the view that colonial theologies and imperial theologies, by their very nature, are idolatrous. They want you to worship something other than God. And so the work of theological reimagination is also a work of dismantling idols. And so some of that work is quite disruptive in your own sense, your own. If all you do is change behaviors or you change words, and you don't do this deeper work of like what is underneath the surface in my behaviors, in my beliefs of how the world is shaped. And when those get challenged, for me anyway, it was a profoundly disorienting experience. And so having a sort of companion in a theology of integral mission at the time, and maybe almost more particularly the people who wrestled with it, the people who wrote and spoke about their own journeys, and then that allowed me and invited me into the same conversation. And then integral mission becomes this theology of hope, recognizing that we do the sort of the early thinkers of it a disservice if we simply take what they wrote about at their times and say, well, we just have to blindly kind of work with it now. The invitation is to do the work and to do the processing. And so that theological work for me becomes then this hope.
Wow, thank you both. I think that's such an important challenge for all of us to receive from these powerful and liberative theologies, but not just receive, to wrestle with them in our own contexts. So I really appreciate you offering both of those prophetic Black theologies and the Misión Integral legacy, which was offered from a Latin American context, and how all of those found fertile ground in South Africa. And now last time we talked about how the colonial theologies were manifesting and impacting people's real lives. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the actions and the manifestations of these liberative theologies now. Specifically, what are the seeds of resistance that are being or were sown that help to change the realities on the ground? This might be a personal example from one of your lives, or maybe a wider movement that's taking place. Could you each share a story? Maybe we'll start with you again, Thandi.
Oh, thank you. Yes, of course. So this is actually, so Zach Stewart is on the call, and I want to talk a little bit about some stories from an activity that that I developed recently and collaborated with Zach on. He made the most amazing art and designed it. I would show you the pictures if I could, but I don't know how well they get seen on a call like this. Um, but the idea of this was to put together some of these histories of resistance from the South African church to apartheid. And there's just such beautiful stories of things people did in resistance to these things. And I think what I've really appreciated about some of these histories is that they're so varied. I think people do so many different things in response. And I think sometimes when we think about our resistance, we don't have much of an imagination for what it could look like. I feel like sometimes when we think of resistance, all we can think of is marches or protests or whatever, which I think are really important and have their place. But there's so many forms of resistance that I think we can draw from. And so I just wanted to mention briefly a couple of different things. So the one is this this action called the Pilgrimage of Confession, and this happened in 1972, and it was a group of around 30 white members of this organization called the Christian Institute, who went on a pilgrimage and walked for 900 kilometers to protest the system of migrant labor and unjust, basically unjust migratory labor system, which kind of meant that Black men were separated from their families and had to live far away from home, and caused so much disruption and harm for Black people in the country. So they did this very long pilgrimage of confession as a way to demonstrate against this. Another thing I really like is this publication called Crisis News. So during the state of emergency, which we kind of touched on last conversation, but that was instituted in 1985. One of the things that it meant was that people could not report on what was going on. There was really like a blackout of any news related to the state of emergency. And so a Christian organization started writing this publication, a weekly publication, to basically to give people news about what was going on. And it was really birthed out of this commitment to social analysis as being integral to a prophetic theology. And so this idea of reading the signs of the times and showing what was going on and telling the truth about that so that prophetic action could emerge out of this. Then there's this also really cool story of something called the Woodstock thesis. And it was kind of modeled off of the actions around the Reformation, where the 95 Theses were nailed to the wall. But it was emerged out of the Anglican Church, and they wrote their own 95 Theses addressing racism within the structures of the church. And then they walked to St. George's Cathedral, which is a cathedral in Cape Town, and nailed this document to the church to try and address the internal racism within the church and within the church structures. then I won't do too many more, because I'll do two more if I may. This one painting, which I really love. So I know Ruth in the chat wrote Art as Resistance, which I really love. And I think this painting was such a beautiful prophetic image of that. And it's called The Black Christ. And it was painted by someone in 1962. And it showed a picture of Jesus being crucified on the cross, but painted, a black Jesus painted in the likeness of Albert Luthuli, who was a Christian anti-apartheid activist. And the people crucifying him on the left were the Minister of Justice at the time, John Forster, and who's known as the architect of apartheid, who was Hendrik Verwoerd. And it was just this really powerful image critiquing the very faith that the apartheid system was using to justify itself. And this kind of artistic declaration that Jesus is not only on the side of the oppressed, but Jesus is the oppressed. And when you are oppressing Black people in this country, you are actually oppressing God. So this amazing art piece. And then the last one I want to talk about is this organization, the Christian Institute's weekly meal, and they called it the CI Agape. And it was this weekly fellowship meal in Cape Town as well. And it just embodied many of these elements of a kind of prophetic theology, and brought people together across various kinds of divides. So it was very much interracial and very, very diverse. And people would eat together and say liturgy together, and speak about the events of the time. And it was also a time of planning and organizing for action for the church in these times. So these are a few of the stories that I really wanted to share, because I think they're such important, wells for us to draw from, and inspiration for us to draw from in thinking about how we resist in our own times. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thandi. And Craig, I think you also had a story you wanted to share.
Yeah, I know she's not the only one who talks about this, but I've been very provoked by Lana Mansour's talk at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference last year, and I don't have the quote right in front of me, but where she named this idea of needing it being in this battle, the struggle for imagination. And one of the things she said, and I won't have the exact words, which is like, if we don't do the work of the imagination, their imagination gets imposed on us. And their imagination is one of violence and revenge and domination and control. And so how do we imagine? And the other person that's inspired me a little bit in his writing in recent years was Miguel de la Torre's book, Embracing Hopelessness. I've often been one who's spoken of hope, and yet perhaps the book that led me most to think about hope in the last few years is his book on hopelessness. And he ends, I won't read the whole poem, but he says in the end, in solidarity with the hopeless, stand disruptive yet decisive, feeling desperation, not despair, agitating, not assimilating. So offer not your words of hope, offer your praxis for justice. Shower me not with God's future promises. Show God's present grace through your loving mercy. And so when hawkers of hope seduce you to join them, and when rationalists wonder why you struggle for justice's unwinnable odds, and when charlatans peddle revelation as revolution, and when a world gone mad questions your very sanity, you can respond with confidence and boldness. I'm hopeless. And for me, what that's unleashed in me and got me thinking more and more about is I am someone who's wanting to think about big change. And if I'm honest, so much of my work over the last decades has felt like it's been spitting into the wind, and in particular in the current context, just things still been overwhelming. And in the city that I live, the town planners of apartheid, I think I referenced last time, spoke about this idea of let's impose our imagination on the city so much that even if they remove the law, they won't be able to deal with the reality. And so I live in a city where the spatial reality still reflects the apartheid reality, where people's access to food and land and the like still reacts it. And so even if I'm hopeless, what does it mean to subvert that? And two of the stories that come to mind just in our family's life, one has been a story of food that really Liesl should be talking about, but I'll tell the story, which is Liesel fearing the sense of deep dis-ease and lament at the way food happens in this country, and beginning to imagine and start thinking about, well, what would it mean to buy cheese from a different place? And literally starting something that became like, well, what if we bought cheese from a supplier rather than from the supermarket? And move forward 10, 15 years, that now is 20 groups of people that buy their food from different places and are outside of the capital understanding or the capitalist imperial understanding of what it means to be involved in the food system. And it's fundamentally changed the way we buy food. It's fundamentally changed the way we eat food. And it does undermine the imperial side of things. And then one that's very fresh for us is then we live in a neighborhood that has resisted the idea of becoming diverse, resisted the idea of being economically and racially diverse. And we've nurtured this initially a seed of imagination of like looking over the wall at an apartment complex next to us and sort of thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if that was different? And then our neighbor imagined something different as the owner, and she started making these flats available to other people. And now we're in the process, and there's a big story behind it that I can tell at another time, of this, what's beginning to feel like quite miraculous, taking ownership of the place so that it continues to be a place of affordable housing for people who wouldn't otherwise fit in here. And so what's been interesting for me is that as we've named this imagination in talking to people, rather than only looking for the large scale solution, actually saying, well, literally, what does it look like in my backyard? It's 10 meters in that direction. What does it look like to have imagination in my own neighborhood? That subverts and undermines. That is hope in a funny way, hopeless about the big change, but is willing to fight for the small change as an act of belief that it subverts the imperial narrative or subverts the thing. And I think that's where, going back to Thandi's and the prophetic theology, is that it requires us to immerse, requires us to have a practice that reflects, so that action comes out of that understanding rather than action coming out of a loose analysis that isn't full. And so those are two stories where I'm seeing hope and seeing subversion in our own lives of an imagination to act in a way that subverts the historic narrative, and hopefully allows us all to start telling a different story.
Again, thank you both. I resonate with the word you gave, Thandi, of these wells. I feel like you've both given us some really profound wells to draw upon as we think about, what might those changes look like, that imagination for our own context, for our own neighborhoods. So thank you for being willing to share those stories. And in just a couple minutes, we'll move to opening the floor for questions and comments from the rest of you. But of course, one question we want to anticipate here is, what would be helpful from your brothers and sisters across the world? How can we partner or participate in actions of resistance as we think about South Africa and we think about this global reality that we are living in today? Craig, maybe you want to get us started.
Solidarity is such an important word. I'm trying to work out what it means. I was thinking about a conversation I had with Ruth on Robben Island a few years ago, where I quite tearfully engaged her on the notion of my identity as a white man and how do I live differently in the world, having an identity that was more rooted. And for me, one of the answers to that question has been like, who am I in solidarity with? Who do I align with when I'm in a room in a big conference? Who do I sit next to? How do I see? And so I think there is a reality for us. And so in this particular story of South Africa right now, I think one of those actions is to stand against the narrative that's been pushed, particularly by the current US administration, but also by elements within South African society, of a story of white Afrikaner genocide, which is fundamentally false. We can share stories about that elsewhere. But to counter that when it gets spoken of, to counter that and just make sure that it's clear. And then I would say, and this is a bigger story, we've got our challenges we need to fight, but we are being isolated, in my view. We are being isolated by the powers that be, because we've taken a stand as South Africa quite deliberately on the Israel-Palestine situation, and that we've been involved in standing against calling Israel to account through the ICJ for its criminal actions in Gaza. And I'm of the view that we're getting punished for that. And I think there are ways in which we can talk about that in solidarity, to start saying these things are acts of revenge and punishment. They're not acts of concern for white Afrikaner refugees. And so actually you may be able to name that in your churches, in your spaces, elsewhere. And we can have, there's not really enough time to talk in more detail, but I hope that helps spark some of the conversation.
Yes, thank you. How about from you, Thandi?
Yeah, I feel like what's needed in these times more than anything is, I think this thing of social analysis really, and being committed to continually doing that work towards being able to, I think, connect our different struggles. Because I think part of what the empire does is to make us feel like these struggles are disconnected. So that what's happening in Palestine is a different issue to the deep inequalities and violence happening in Cape Town in South Africa. That's disconnected from what's happening in Sudan and the Congo. I think we need to get better at, recognizing power and how it operates, so that we can collectively better organize against it. I think something that I've been thinking about a lot is what's happening in Palestine, I think, has galvanized significant activism and solidarity in the South African context in a really powerful way that I think is also guiding us to revisit our own unfinished story of freedom, the things that we still need to address in our own context, which I think is really powerful. And yeah, I think we need to find ways of doing this work that connects these issues rather than sees them as separate. Because I think we often see that tendency, like we shouldn't be addressing this issue because there's all these other issues going on. And I think that distracts us from the tactics of the empire, which are to separate and make us feel like even our struggles are in competition with each other. So the more I think we can connect and recognize that we're doing the same thing, we are fighting towards a different world that is just for everyone who lives in it, and for the planet and the cosmos. And so these things are the same struggles, whether they're struggles of LGBTQI justice and violence against these groups of people in various places in the world, or the genocide in Gaza. These struggles are connected, and the more we can make these connections, I think the better chance we have of being able to resist them.
Wow, thank you both. This has already been so challenging, inspiring for me. What questions or comments are there from the rest of you? Feel free to raise your hand through the chat feature in Zoom, or if you have your camera on, I will keep my eye out for you.
Perhaps there are thoughts about examples of people seeding hope in alternatives, like those that Craig and Thandi shared with us. Art, a different way of thinking and living about food.
I see Amanda's hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Craig and Thandi. It's so good to be with you all again a little more than a month later. I had a question about if you could give us some imagination about how this might look along lines that are divisive theologically. So, for instance, how have you found these moments of resistance, or seen these moments of resistance, or what do you imagine from your own research and from your own faith and your own moral imagination that this might look like when we're bringing groups together and trying to inspire and mobilize solidarity and alternative communities when there isn't full agreement, say around the LGBTQ issue or around Israel-Palestine? So when we get to the nitty-gritty of bringing these communities together, and there isn't full alignment, there is still that discomfort and that moment of awakening on either sides that needs to happen. What do these alternative communities look like? Or what do you imagine? Or what do you see in your history, in your faith, in scripture that could inspire us in these uncomfortable moments of like co-living and co-creating things together?
Craig? Jokes. That's such a hard and good question. It's really hard, I think, because especially when there's things, I mean, I find it so hard, especially when there's things that, I feel so strongly about, and that are such key justice issues, and that there are theologies that are literally harming people, like in the material world. However, I think what feels like a kind of anchor for me and rooting for me is this idea that we are all in process. None of us are finished, and we're all on a journey. We all have places that we need to grow and freedom that we need to embrace, God's freedom in various ways. And so I think that's a really important starting point. The idea of, I think, like the ongoing salvation, like salvation not just as a thing that happens in a moment, but that a thing that happens over our lifetime. And I think a lot of myself and Craig work together at an organization called The Warehouse. And a lot of that work was working with churches and church leaders, church people in response to various forms of injustice. And I think there's an orientation, or I think there needs to be an orientation in all of this work that we're coming to learn together, that none of us has all of the answers, but that we're learning together. And I mean, I think there's things that are non-negotiable, but we journey together also, I think. Yeah, so I think that's a hard one. And I feel like from my answer also, you can definitely hear that I don't have it figured out, but I'm very much committed to the journey and what that looks like, to move us all towards a place that is more liberated.
Yeah, so I had a chance to think. Thanks for answering, Thandi. But one of the things in our previous work that we were involved in that became a narrative with us was, so just a couple of loose thoughts more than anything, rather than a structured coherence. But one of them is the difference between trolls and seekers, was something we used to talk about as a frame. And so for us, seekers became people who were genuinely interested and inclined towards crossing bridges, even if they were far away from us in terms of our understanding. Even if their ideas seemed offensive, they were genuinely seeking and moved. And trolls were things that hid under bridges and tried to stop you from crossing those bridges, even if they potentially were close to you and seemed closer to you. And so this sense of discernment about like, what's the spirit that's happening here, and that sometimes knock the dust off your feet and move away because it's not worth putting the effort in, and sometimes it's worth investing time. So that'd be my first one. The second one, I think, is like who does the work of it. And back in the days at the Christian Institute and coming out of some of the Black consciousness work that, from my understanding, is kind of like, for example, the work of white conscientization. So white people doing the heavy lifting and sometimes the wounding lifting of having to engage. Or straight people dealing with straight people, so or men dealing with men, like all of those situations where there's an opportunity to do the work with the people who thing. And I don't think that's an exclusive thing. I don't think that's a fixed rule, but I do think knowing who's doing the work and when you've got the energy for the work would be there. And then the third one that's been transformative for me in all of these spaces is forming a pattern of reading the Bible together with those that I disagree, just in a sort of engagement. And Ruth telling me stories, I remember years ago, of engagement I think it was in El Salvador, where you worked with church leaders across the spectrum, reading the Bible together. And I know for me, reading the Bible together with people, engaging in contextual Bible study and hearing somebody respond. The Bible's like double-edged sword. All those things that my Baptist pastor told me turned out to be true. The Bible's a double-edged sword that cuts between bone and marrow, that unlocks imagination, that does all these things. But if you read it with people who just like you, then it's just idolatrous. Whereas if you genuinely have an opportunity to engage with the text, then, and with people whose lived experience and social location is different. And so creating those opportunities in pilgrimage and in drink, I think those would be my 3 loosely linked points to Mandy's question.
Thank you, Mandy. I did see Abraham had a question. Are you still around, Abraham, and you want to voice that, or shall we go with one of the questions in the chat?
Yes, I'm around. I'm just excited. I missed the other session, but I'm just excited with the things that I've heard already, and rejoicing deeply about the shared beliefs, but also the shared concerns for the world, and especially the theme for today. I'm here at the Andrew Wall Centre here in Liverpool Hope University. I'm the director for the centre, and just a little bit, just very briefly about Andrew Walls. Before he died, he was working on a project that kind of rationalizes the role of the center, which he didn't found. It was named after him by the then Vice Chancellor here at Hope University, Professor Gerald Pillay, from South Africa, by the way, born in Durban, went to live in New Zealand, and then came up here. But the project, for me, it's what's interesting about that project is how he described it. And he called that project, the theme for the project was decolonizing of missions. So when he died, his computer was still lit up on his desk, and still the document was in, ongoing. And Ingrid has been working, his widow, on the project. So I'm just rejoicing that what we're discussing today is kind of a continuation of that conversation, that unfinished task, mission, in ways that are tangible and ways that, kind of beyond the academy. Obviously, we are all, in one or the other, linked, connected, or based in academic institutions, but talking about it in ways that touches lives directly. I have a story, just a very brief story, just so that I don't dominate the space. The other day, I went to the local supermarket. I just went to buy milk, as you do. And I met a lady, her name is Doreen, 68-year-old lady, from the Caribbean. I knew Doreen. We met early last year, because she actually came to buy our car. We were selling our old car, and she came to buy it. So you get to know how you invite someone for a cup of tea. And then I got to know her, and she sat in our house for about an hour, and she told me about her grandparents, about her family, growing up in a sugarcane plantation in the Caribbean. And then she bought the car and she went, and I didn't see her for a while until last week. Bumped into her in the shop, in the supermarket, and we must have chatted for about maybe less than 10 minutes, maybe 7-8 minutes. But as soon as I saw her, she beamed and she said, "Abraham, how wonderful to see you." And I said, "Oh, how wonderful to see you, Doreen." And we chatted, and before long, we were all laughing out loud. I mean, unrestrained. I was laughing at the top of my voice because of the things she said, and she was laughing back. And I just felt a release, a freedom, a defiance of the circumstances around me. Here at the university, we are going through a very major period of redundancies. People are being made redundant, and this is sector-wide across the UK. There's a lot of agony. I meet people where we live, we just moved houses actually, where we lived, people who are connected with the Middle East, whether it's Palestine itself, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan. We have lots of Iranian refugees who come to our church, and Afghanis as well. But that moment, you might think, oh, laughing is normal. But I thought, yeah, laughing for me was a form of not only freedom, but resistance to accept the circumstances around me. And the way to laugh was to meet in person, face to face, and to see each other, to reconnect with my fellow human beings, even strangers we didn't know. And I realized we can actually defy the things in life that put us down, the things in life that dehumanize, that dispossess, just by being human with one another. And then we had another event. It was a barbecue, and this Iranian family I'm talking about came along, and we sat next to each other and we talked. And I realized I can really connect with these refugees in ways that I can't connect with my colleagues at the university or with fellow white neighbors in the white neighborhood that I live. So my story, the point I'm making is sometimes it may take very little effort. It may not even cost money or just time to be with fellow human beings and resist to be put down, resist to be restricted, resist to be ghettoized, resist to be racialized. Just being with fellow human beings and laughing out loud and crying, if crying is the right appropriate. So when we talked with my friends about Iran and how the situation is today, I cried out loud. I mean, openly, not loud, but openly, and they cried back, and I just felt a freedom, a resistance, a refusing to be put down, a refusing to accept dehumanizing theologies, dehumanizing ideologies. So I just want to just share. There are easier and ways that don't cost even money, that we can actually resist in the most human way, and it may just involve laughing, being together with other human beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abraham, for sharing that other example of resistance from where you're coming from right now. I think that's encouraging for all of us. Let's go with one last question here in the chat from Joel Duncan. Can either of you talk a little bit more on this idea of, or act of, recognizing and responding to the power dynamics? Have you seen anywhere that this has happened that you could share and continue to spark our imaginations?
Seeing as Craig always waits for me to go, so he has time to think about it. Jokes. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think I've been in spaces that have really tried to do this. And I think trying is an important word here, because it feels like it's always kind of an experiment, because I think in any of these things, we're trying to operate in ways that are really in defiance of so much of what the rest of the world kind of dictates to us. And so I think actually the time at the warehouse is a really interesting example of this, because I think we were an organization, but I think we were much more than that. It was very, very much a space of community. And we really tried to practice these ways of being that I think resisted these power dynamics and hierarchies and things. And I think, that's like an example on quite a small and interpersonal level, but I think it really requires constant like self-reflection and reflection in terms of what's going on in the world and your position in the world. And I think that's those spaces of like personal engagement and our personal communities are really important spaces of, I think, trying to like practice getting good at recognizing power and how it operates, even in, interactions between two people or a few people, recognizing how privilege operates, how hierarchies reassert themselves in different ways, how people continue to be marginalized often in quite subtle ways. And I actually think this personal work of recognizing power and how it operates actually serves us in recognizing that in the world, because I think it's similar dynamics, I think, that are operating out there and also internally within us. I really like, so Alan Busak has a book called Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Waters. And it feels really evocative as a title, because it's almost like this idea that, you're free, you get freedom from these systems of slavery or oppression, only to confront a different kind of pharaoh on the other side. And so I think this is ongoing work of practicing how to see and understand and analyze power and how it operates. I've recently been part of a reading group that's reading Walter Wink's book Engaging the Powers, and I think he gives a really great some great thoughts about power and how it operates. I think there's various other people, but I think it's a topic that we need to engage much more.
Maybe I'll just make one 30-second comment. I mean, we've joked a little bit about us trying to work out who's going to unmute their mic first. But in my world, one of the places I've become conscious, particularly, and I'm certainly not the first person to notice this, is who speaks first in group situations, in dialogue, in conversation. And you don't need a sociology degree to recognize that for the vast majority, white men speak first. Here in South Africa, white men and white people in general will dominate a conversation very quickly. And it's often the progressive woke people like me who are first to jump in, because we're very clever and we thought about these things very deeply and we need to tell everybody else. And so that's the way power operates, because it fills the vacuum. And so one imagination, which I've tried to quietly impose on myself, is that I don't speak in situations like that until a woman has spoken and a black person has spoken both. And not because they're reticent, because other people speak. I sometimes have to wait a very long time before there's an opportunity to speak. And the internal power disruption that happens for me as I'm waiting is quite something. So I think that, and then being aware in structures. So I was on a school board for a while, and our hiring practices appeared to have a racial element to it, because we were hiring, and yet the people weren't racist. And what we did was ask the question, well, where's the power in the story, and where is it being played out? And we realized it was being played out in advertising processes and where things happened. And so doing a little bit of an analysis of that, recognizing that the people in the interview probably weren't being overtly racist, certainly, but recognizing there were other power things, enabled us to shift over 2 years the outcome of hiring practices by recognizing those hidden patterns of power. And I think that's where the social analysis comes in, like in our micro scales, where are these hidden patterns of power playing, and how do we disrupt them?
Amen. Thank you both again so much for your contributions during this time, and to all of you who were willing to join with us in this conversation and offer your comments and questions. And a quick note for those of you who are listening to this as a podcast about what Thandi mentioned earlier as a project that she and Zach Stewart are working on. It is called the Freedom Theologies Game, and it brings together stories of liberative theologies and artwork and the people that were involved as an interactive game that people can play with one another to learn and engage with these realities in their contexts. This Freedom Theologies game is new and is not yet widely available, but as soon as we know more and we have it in a platform that can be shared, we will be sure to publish the information on INFEMIT's website and other channels. So stay tuned, and we'll wait to hear from Thandi about that. we do want to just spend some time, a moment in prayer together as we close this out. So again, thank you. And I hope that we can all continue this work in our own lives and contexts as we leave today. Ruth, would you go ahead and close us in prayer?
Sure. Just recently, Walter Brueggemann passed on. He was pretty elderly, and he's somebody who has inspired a lot of this, considering the interaction between imagination and hope. So before the prayer, I just want to read one little citation from him. He says, "Hope, on the one hand, is an absurdity too embarrassing to speak about, for it flies in the face of all those claims we have been told are facts. Hope is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. And one does that only at great political and existential risk. On the other hand, hope is subversive, for it limits the grandiose pretensions of the present, daring to announce that the present, to which we have all made commitments, is now called into question." And so, yes, along with Craig, we can say, yes, let's embrace hopelessness, the shallow optimism of us mending everything, of us making it all happen. But let's count on God's future and on God's purposes in the midst of the current reality, and call into question the imperviousness of that reality. So let's pray with that in mind. Our God, we do just want to affirm the fact that you are God, you are good, you are present, even when so many things might tell us or make us doubt that presence, doubt that goodness, doubt your love for your world. And yet we do cling to that confidence because of your Son, because of what Jesus showed us in life, in death, in resurrection, in the mode of Jesus' reign, a reign of accompaniment, of presence, of solidarity. So as we grapple with these things, not just in concept and in conversation, but in our real lives, in the way we interact, in the way we engage with the issues at hand, we pray that your Spirit will continue seeding hope in our hearts, in our minds, in our communities, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our churches. Lord, we trust in you for this, not because of anything we can achieve, but because of your grace and your presence. We count on that and pray in the name of your Son and counting on the work of your Spirit among us. Amen.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the platform you prefer. If you think this could be helpful for someone you know, please share it with them. The best compliment we can receive is a referral to someone else. See you next time!